Absolutely. A
Well, good
lot of
evening,
natural things
folks.
were happening,
Welcome
but it
to
was a good time to
Delicious
call
Recipe
out
with Adele
somebody that
here on
maybe you
UPRN
weren't in sync
Radio,
with and you
which
weren't
airs at
necessarily
9
happy that
Eastern
she was part of the
Time.
community.
So
So
tonight's
it was
topic
something.
we're going to go through, I titled it Hot Fudge Sundae with All the Toppings. And it sort of gets into this part of the global warming, climate change debate, which always seems to be an issue that's been going on for, well, quite a while now. I guess since really the 70s, it sort of came into a real notice. But before that, it was talked about with, well, there was geoengineering that was happening, and we didn't really understand the impacts, I believe, that we were making on our environment. And I really have, like, actually, to say about myself, there is back in the 1990s, when I went to college, I was taking electrical engineering, and then they started a new course, and my dad there, when he was alive there, he told me, he says, oh, you should get into this environmental engineering. So they opened up a program here in at the Confederation College in Thunder Bay. First year program, it was called Environmental Engineering Technology. And it was deal with many different facts with this new environmental problem. So I took 2 years of that program here, and it dealt with, well, the chemistry and a whole bunch of different topics with regulations. And during that time, too, I also worked 2 summer contracts with the Ministry of Environment and Energy in abatement. So I got to see how government runs with the environment, and with school, what we talked about with different topics, and just with the engineering part. So the environment, I always sort of I was always sort of interested in what effects we have, and I really started. I, s- I sort of see both sides of the conflict there. You have your very green engineer or green people that believe that all contact with the earth, that everything is wrong, and then you see uh, the part is that how can we coexist and not pollute anymore. And so it came into this part with global warming, and I sort of really in climate change, and really find that those are sort of buzzwords that a lot of these debate people or green people or politicians use when they're running for office. And you've had these movies, the Al Gore movie that came out there back a bunch of years ago, and now you have this Greta Thunberg person that comes through. We could talk about her a little bit later, and about her role into this propaganda machine of trying to one side an argument by cherry picking climate facts. So I always looked at it like with global warming and climate change. They use these as a buzzword in a way, but they don't actually really explain where they're getting all their facts from. I always thought environmental impact was a better way of looking at it, and what businesses and our day-to-day lives do to our environment. Like you can look back to things like what invasive species and what they've done to our water systems. Like there was a big one that happened years ago with the Asian carp, and it's still an ongoing problem that going through the Mississippi and the waterways through there, that they just eliminate all the other species by destroying all the food and their beds and stuff like that, and they wipe out other species, native species, and we have that uh, in a very in other animal species too along as well, where they brought in wolves into Yellowstone, but they brought in these larger Canadian wolves, which basically destroyed all the foxes and deer, and it's all an imbalance. And you can look back to environment in Australia when they brought in the cane toads to uh, deal with their beetle population. And as you know, what the story that went with that is that the cane toads were they proliferated, or they bred super fast, but their eating process, they didn't like the beetles, and nothing ate them because they tasted bitter to the native wildlife that was around there. So they just grew and grew, and then they end up having problems, environmental problems with these cane toads, and the accidents on the road. They just can't get rid of them. And that's always been a sort of thing, even with South America, with bringing in crossbreeding African bees into with the native honeybees, and then that's where you end up having the killer bee problem. So with also with the part with the global warming initiative, you see this. This is usually a talking point with most green parties and other parties when it comes to election time. They always talk about bringing in new carbon taxes, green taxes, but they're mostly, well, the way I see it is that it's mostly to give an awareness to yourself, but it's I think it's more or less to do with government and big business companies and what they're doing to pollute, because the average household isn't smelting metals and making tires and burning stuff, or making electricity, or burning coal and fossil fuels, but we're mostly the average human is using cars, but and burning fuel. And there's been other things that have happened with the fuel to have cleaner burning fuels. And the part about our environmental impact into what is actually going on here. Um, you can look at how we've changed the face of our Earth, or the terrestrial Earth, um, in a way with large factory farming, uh, huge crops, and what it's done to soil mineralization, with drying and droughts and water. And you look at how we've sort of done this sort of impact in a way that we haven't really sort of thought this out properly, with rotating crops, uh, rotating animals, and just because our you got to figure is that back before our population boom globally across the board has been slowly increasing. I think we're up to what now, 7.6 billion people. So there's huge resources that is needed for food for us to survive. And for a long time, we, through I guess the 1900s, we didn't look at, or even before that, we didn't really look at what we were making and how it was produced, and how we were getting rid of our waste products and the products that we consume. So you look at what it happened with our garbage dumps, and you can look at it that globally too, as well as what other countries have basically used as a dumping ground. They've used the oceans just to dump materials off, and big businesses and corporations have dumped their effluent untreated into the water for a long time. And then I guess around, well, when I started getting into it into in the 90s, but before that, they were getting into big business and dealing with scrubbing their exhaust pipes, cleaning effluent, and it ended up being a big cost that was involved to the private. Well, I guess you wouldn't say private, right? I guess it would be private in a way, like a big business or industry, I should say, like the automotive industry, all the different metals and rubber, plastics, uh, fuel, consumption, a whole bunch of different factors to make all these products to make what we use here today, and then how we use it. So we started looking at the part where when I got in with the Ministry of Environment, we were doing water sampling. So one of my contracts that I did was in the district of Northern Ontario, Thunder Bay District. We went around and we looked at logging operations and what they were doing in the bush, cutting down trees. and we inspected their bases of operation where they held their fuel tanks in the bush, and where they did all the repairs, what they were bringing in to make like a zero impact. But also then we looked at how they were reforesting the area to make it viable to grow new trees again, because that's a was never ever talked about a long time ago, was making things renewable again. And I know it's been a big thing up here, or with the tree planting, and I know it goes along in other places around the world, and it's getting into a big topic. I believe in the last article I read that someplace in Africa they were replanting trees down there, like millions of trees to bring back what had been removed. And you look at places like the rainforest, where they're deforesting places like that for precious minerals, gold, trees, mahogany, and other type of, I think it was another one was ebony wood, that are rare trees. But and when it comes to these, I guess you'd say third world countries, we're not looking at, they're not being regulated in a way that would make it renewable. And the part is that with the, you can get into what is the cause and effects of global warming or climate change, and there's various factors that happen with this. And the part that ends up I always sort of turn an eyebrow up to, and is when people start spouting off facts, and they cherry pick little parts of ideas. For our Earth, we have a very relative, not relative understanding, or not a very understanding of the time period of our Earth. There's lots of debate on how long the Earth has been here, what the cycles of the Earth have been, and you look at what they did with climate change models at the very beginning of the climate change models. They, when we had computers, they started implementing those things. So what they could do is they could go back and they could look at historical facts that were written down. Now, whether these facts were correctly not calculated, but reported or observed at that time, that's all that we have to go with, because it was never a priority to record specifics for what we needed. And when I think it was in the 1970s and 80s, and you had to figure back then we had very rudimentary computers. They didn't have that much to really go on for information besides what we had and collected at that time. They'd plugged in these dates and values, and was put down at a time there. They made the world, or the globe, as a cylinder, and they basically because our computer stuff, they didn't have the processes that we have there today, and they plotted out there with a non-terrestrial or geographical heights, and that they just put in calculations around this Earth on basically a flat planed cylinder. And then they looked at what could happen with the different values across the Earth. So they separated the Earth into these 100-mile grid squares, plugged all these values into this program, and they looked how this square impacted this square and this square, but they never had values for geographical elevations and height, wind data, which was blowing across valleys, mountain ranges, deserts, water. They just what they had there. So they came up with a very generic program that they could sort of assess what was sort of going on. It was very limited in its values. And then as this program progressed and progressed further, they were able to, with computers getting bigger, they add more functions and change that flat flat plane cylinder into a more, I guess, elevated prediction range, and add in more factors, because we didn't have a lot of satellites going up that were measuring specific climate details, or stuff sitting in the ocean or around these reporting stations around the Earth. So our gathering of data really, in effect, has only really happened that we could have this is since our technology age. So you got to look at that part there, is that our data that we have that we're making predictions for the future, is that you need to have a basis of what you can have here in the present. But then to predict the future, you have to also have hindsighting in the back. So you have to know what was back in the past. And there's lots of problems about what happens in the past, because, well, there's a lot of debate between, you could say, with different views on science, and this gets into other topics there between creationists and evolutionists and times of what the Earth was, and this problem comes up. Like, they're all multifaceted problems that affect how you're predicting and what you're predicting in the future. So understanding the past is a big proponent to understanding now and later on. So we don't have that sort of information from the past. We have these predictive things, and everything is that the information we have is observable now that we've started observing and recording. So everything beforehand, sorry if I'm sort of rambling in a circle here, is understand on what we use of technology today. So a lot of things that you'll hear talking about, radiometric dating, carbon dating, where they're going through and they're drilling into spheres of ice or soil, going back, and then they're measuring using these dating systems. But the problem with these dating systems is that they're fallible, and you can watch. There's a few different topics. They just put in their problems with carbon dating and radiometric dating, and put that in your computer, and you could see a whole bunch of different YouTube videos and different sites on the internet. And what is end up happening? What I've sort of understood out of it, and looking at it, is that you have scientists that have a certain point of view that they want to prove their point of view, and they take the information that they have, and that's what they base it on. So you can have I'll give you an example here, is that they had some snails that they were dating, and they were carbon dating these snails, and they found out that these snails were 25,000 years old. But the only problem was what the snails were alive still in the tank. So there's problems that happen with the dating methods, and even with the radiometric dating, when you're talking about uranium isotopes, or I think there's 5 different processes that deal with this decay rate, and they'll give you different values for the same object that you're trying to date. And so what they do is they go and they take where there's a consistency from one that's close to an area. That's why you always get a dating that it could be plus or minus 5,000 years, but then you'll have another one that could be off by 50,000 years. And then when you do another a dating form, a decay form, you'll get different values where they're there. So they'll go and they'll pick one that says that fits into their hypothesis or their theory. And that's where the part where these dating processes go through, and you have to sort of look at it sort of objectively about who is and what they are, what they're trying to portray to get their sort of message across. So with the creation of the Earth, when they're dating stones, you got to figure back then is that there's a whole part of the process is that the Earth was created, and it was a bunch of rocks out in space, and then they coalesced together and they formed and they created this Earth. So when you're dating something, you have to know when something was created. So when you don't have a clue about when it was created and when things formed, but you have just a theory of it, you can't get proper data as to what it was. So the part with these dating processes is that you don't know what the actual events or the observation of that time was. Was there more solar radiation? How was the atmosphere? See, what is happening now is that what they do is they take what they have, what is known now, and they assume or predict or work out, and they figure that there's a constant, that it went back beforehand, but nobody was back there to observe what actually was the conditions of these of the time. You could add, like I said, more solar radiation or less solar radiation. There could have been more uh, asteroid nuclearization going into the earth, and that's where you end up getting problems and with these dating processes. So to understand how the earth was and different climates, and if we are actually going through a climate change, a global warming, a global cooling part, we don't have a historical timeline that can go through this to accurately predict exactly what is happening. So there's so many factors that can happen in there. So a big one that they've been talking about was that the polar caps are melting, and there's so many factors that can be uh, uh, associated to that, and a lot of that stuff there goes down to, there's a thing called the, if I get this right, the Milankovitch cycles, and that deals with the Earth, with its eccentricity, the Earth's orbit, how it orbits around the sun. You get the tilt of the Earth precession, how it goes and tilts over 41,000 years, and the obliquity. And you got to figure is that as the Earth is moving around, the Earth is tilting through a cycle, which causes the Earth to get more solar radiation from the sun over periods of time. So there's always a cycle that things are always moving. Now, is it a whole part that we are causing a lot of this global warming? I like the, or I'll say whatever the word that I like to use, environmental impact. Correct. We are, like, you can't have the, see how I wrote it down here to say here. The only way to have zero impact is to eliminate the impactor, which would be us. And that's not possible. So you find ways to lessen the impact. And the thing is, though, that everybody doesn't see impact the same way. So is there ways that we can control what we impact on the earth? Correct. Yes, there is. It's a whole thing about changing your lifestyle and getting out of your comfort zone and dealing with things like whether it is to use greener biodegradable products, but it all comes down to a want and need. And you see this a lot within big city stuff, is that we're as averse to rural areas, where in the city you have the impact, the environmental impact on the earth is widely widely felt. There is that you've taken away a lot of green space to put in a lot of concrete space, and with doing that, concrete and the sun, you get more heat, which causes cities to be a lot hotter. You don't have the trees to help filter out carbon. So those are all in part environmental impacts. Whereas out where you go residential, you have a lot more greenery and less pollution, less people. So the part with this, when it comes with this global warming part, is to find out what factors are causing what is the theorists and these climate people and the climate deniers. And I'm more of an environmental impact person, as I said before. So getting back to the part there with this, the global warming, where they're having these recessions in polar ice caps. Now, what is suspectedly reported is that the Earth is getting a lot warmer, and Now, is that impact on what we're doing with industry? Is that with the cars we drive, with the population, with the way the farming is? These are all lots of factors that can influence this. Is it a part that with the geoengineering and dealing with the atmosphere above? And there's actually a really interesting site if you want to check it out there. It's done by Jim Lee. He has a YouTube channel, is Jim Lee Lee, and he also has a website you can go to is climateviewer.org. And with him is that there's a lot of country and government and scientists, private sector scientists that have all been experimenting on different ways to affect the atmosphere and thus affects the climate. Sorry about that. And so he had about 10 different things that are studies and technologies that are being used right now. And you got to figure back beforehand is that there was always impact that companies and government were doing with climate and clouds and like cloud seeding and to bring rain in to areas and to influence our weather. Now, our weather is a big direct component to our climate, because you got to figure is that climate cools and warms every day. That's just a cycle. And the part about putting this that is global warming is just using that as sort of a buzzword. Like it every day it warms up and every night it cools down. So you get these groups that use these terms, and they use them as sort of a scare term. I remember back watching that television show or that movie, the Al Gore movie, and it gave you sort of a very one-sided picture on what was going on with our planet, and it gave you sort of this doomsday factor. And sorry, I'm going off a topic here again, but with this doomsday factor, they've been predicting these doomsday factors for 50 to 70 years. Or you gotta figure is they always had this part. I remember back is to be okay. Well, by this date, this is the irreversible date, and climate is going to change, and there's no turning back from this part. We're going to be flooded underwater. We're going to have huge droughts, and like everything's going to burn up. The sun's going to burn up the earth, but that never happened. And then they said, oh, it's going to be global cooling part where it's going to be so cold that we won't be able to go out there. And there was lots of different science fiction movies that sort of played around with these factors, like The Day After Tomorrow, and which were all sort of interesting sort of theories and about what could happen. It was always the worst case scenario. And we've always had this sort of worst case scenario. We've had that with the Cold War. What if nuclear bombs hit, and what would happen to the Earth? But again, back to this Jim Lee, is that with these private contractors, what they've been testing with over across the world and other places all around, ionospheric heaters, sounding rockets, which causes seeding, satellites, lasers, cloud seeding, cloud ionizers, stratospheric aerosol injections, which we get from like say planes and stuff like there, and contrail includes cirrus cloud development, ships out in the ocean there, spraying up lots of moisture with particulate and water vapor pollution. And if you check out on his channel there, Jim Lee, he goes through it in depth there about the different processes that testing facilities that have been doing this all around the world, like about the one that's been talked about with HARP. And it's been said that that's all about just testing radiometric, sending radio waves through the ionosphere. And but they also the conspiracy on that is that it's also been used to influence weather and direct wind patterns and cloud formation, and to dispel it or to produce it. And you have another part of weather that has been dealt with is over in the United Arabs, Dubai area, and they have these ionospheric antennas that they have around there, and they've reported what they do is they send up a frequency up into the atmosphere, which causes rain, and you can watch videos on that and how they're set up and how they work and how they're influencing the weather there. And China, up in the northern part of China, they have also a type of a HARP reactor up there too as well, which is used to push weather patterns and to affect the jet stream to move it around. And you can watch all these videos. You can watch them. You can Google these type of things of different company weather that affect our climate. So when it gets to the part there is that you have these green people. They are partially right. Is that we do, as a human being, we do affect. We are an impactor on the earth in what we do. So if you're out if you're changing the oil in your car and you just toss it down into your sewer, or you're burning your waste tires in your backyard, you are unnecessarily creating more of a problem than the recycling problem. And what we do here in North America does affect places over in other countries, but also what other countries are doing does affect what's happening over here. And I'm all for regulation and for abiding by to do less environmental impact and to maintain our renewable resources. But also the part there is also I'm a realist, and I sort of saw this when I work with the government too, is that you just can't stop industry and technology and progression. That's just a fact that no one will ever think about or even stopping. Like if you wanted to stop all the carbon polluters in the world, you got to figure what's that going to do? Is that all you'd be left with is you wouldn't have any more technology being built, because you need to create the materials for your cars, your computers, your circuit boards, your phones, the equipment to make your do your farming. So your tractors, your blades, your roads. So stopping all industry from being carbon polluters or being waste effluent polluters that pollute into the water. All you can do is basically you can regulate them and reduce emissions and that are going out, or find other processes that can make it less impactful to what we're doing. You got to look is that when the production of plastics came out, ended up being a huge benefit to modern society. It eliminated the heavy use of glass and metal, and plastics are produced super easily, and they could be crushed down. They were light, easier to travel with. They were inexpensive. You didn't have to worry about the recycling problem at the beginning, because everything just went to the landfill. But then they found out is that with plastics, with the PETs, and there's a lot of them, and we get into them, is that there's problems with them with toxicity and their breakdown ability in landfills, whereas that where we had papers and glass and where they could be crushed and chopped up and they would recycle back, and it's just the same thing as using as a compost with food items. And you could redo with metals. You could scrap iron, scrap metal, and reuse them. With the plastics, there was a process that there was no real process of recycling them back at the beginning. And a lot of countries even in America, they had the barges that were leaving from New York and places from China and Japan as well was just dumping these large um, volumes of garbage into the oceans, and now that's been sort of it was sort of stopped, but it's still an ongoing thing that still ends up happening. And you look at what happened in the Pacific; they call it the Pacific Blob, which is a whole bunch of plastic material. And the way that the water systems work, it's a rotating sort of vortex in the or cycle or circular pattern that happens in the Pacific. And these plastics just sort of sit there floating in the water, and they slowly break down. They release their chemicals into the water, and that's an environmental impact. And it causes uh, problems with our fish species, with the phytoplankton, with reflecting solar uh, radiation, reflecting it, absorbing it. There's a whole bunch of factors that go with that. Now, is that a cause for all the global warming? No. Is that a pollution factor and environmental impact factor? Correct. Yes, it is. And is that causing global warming? Maybe, maybe not. The science is still out on there. You just can't make a definitive proof on it saying that that is the cause. And it's the whole thing that comes with this carbon footprint. Is there a impact that carbon emissions are causing all of global warming? No. Is it an environmental impact? Yes. How much of it is undetermined, but you'll have different groups that will just cherry pick certain points out of that and say this is the reason, and this is what has to be stopped. It says, well, you're not going to stop production, you're not going to stop technology moving forward, but there is a way that we can reduce, and that's the whole thing of this reduce, reuse uh, system has sort of come into, is that new technologies are being used to recycle plastics and recycle tires, recycle metals, and which causes this sort of this circular pattern, which ends up being more beneficial for us. So we're not doing these huge mining operations and destroying, or not destroying, or excavating into the earth, and using up resources that are not renewable. You got to figure is that, as in dating stuff does decay and does turn from one thing to another. You can't make something go from one state to back to another state of matter. It as it degrades, it slowly degrades. You can't go back to the new material unless you have parent new material to go to. And that's part with this whole dating thing. A lot of this stuff all ties together, and this is the part that I try to make people sort of understand, is with the part with these global uh, dating people and stuff like that, is that we don't know what the parent material was. We don't know what the previous impact of solar radiation was on the earth. We don't know the conditions. We don't know that data. And so all we do is we assume it's similar to what it is now, which is never a good way to start predicting things off of assumptions and off of unobservable data to predict the future. So that's where you get these climate models of what's going on, is that a lot of factors are not put in there. We don't have other factors of what a geoengineering is doing to the climate on the earth. And when it came down to the part, getting back to the part with the poles melting and the ice caps receding, is there's a whole part about there's talking about, says yes, the polar ice caps are going to melt, and the water is going to rise up to 10 to 100 to 200 feet above what it is currently today. Now there is scientific data that has said that actually the waters have been rising, I think, over the last 10 years, but I guess at a yearly rate is like 0.1257 of an inch, which is is an amount, but it's not as big as what they're talking about, 10 to 100 feet over in this 12-year cycle that everything's going to go underground. Now, if you've heard this or seen this, if you don't know, the Dan Penna, uh, he made a sort of interesting point. Whether you like him or not, anyways, but it is an interesting point because this guy is a billionaire. He teaches million people to become millionaires and billionaires, and he does a lot of investments. And his point, he was at a conference, and this lady said, "What are you going to do about global warming and the rising oceans?" And what he had said is that that's all just a big, huge hoax. Said he said he wished that he came up with it before Al Gore. He would have made millions of dollars off of it. He said you got to look at the Earth. A majority of the Earth population, I think it's over about 65%, all lives along coastlines or in sea level type conditions. So rising sea levels would rise up enough that you would flood out all major cities, lots of the U.S., parts of Canada, lots of Europe, uh, South America, and India. And what he say is that said if that was going on, and said banks wouldn't be investing in properties that are on the coastlines if these global catastrophes of rising seawaters are coming up. And it sort of does make sort of a point there. If you're aware of, I don't know if I talked on this before, but Norway is building, I think it's a $47 billion infrastructure roadway system from the south to the north. And it consists of tunnels that go through through the mountains, all underground, about 380 meters, I think, down to a point which would be about a quarter of a mile. And it leaves every coastal city that it comes to. It joins up all along the coast. It goes underneath the fjords. Some of them are really ingenious projects where they're actually floating tunnels deep below the water. And some of them are uh, bridges that go down to a point in the water down to sea level, and then the tunnel progresses then underneath the water to allow shipping traffic to go through back into the shoreline earth on the other side underwater, and then continue all underground. And this is all underground infrastructure, $47 billion worth. And Denmark has also built a tunnel as well that's right at shore at sea level, and the roadway was built out, and then the tunnel disappears halfway through this fjord area and proceeds underwater through a tunnel system to continue on. So these are at sea level right now, billions of dollars of money and science done on these underwater tunnel systems. So you got to figure is that if you're spending $47 billion being constructed today, and you have these environmental groups saying that the polar ice caps are melting at such a rate that within 12 years or 20 years that the sea levels are going to rise up to 100 feet, all this stuff that they're building right now would be all underwater. It would be totally useless. So there's got to be some sort of semblance of reason when you're looking at when people are giving you facts onto what is, if they're just taking and cherry picking facts to present their point to make you believe what they're saying, or you have to look at the reality of what is actually happening. Now, you look at they're saying, okay, well, water currents are rising. You got the ocean temperatures are increasing and also cooling, and you get into water science now. What is causing this? Well, they say the polar ice caps are melting, and it has been showed, yes, there is a recession. Polar ice caps are melting, but also as that water is melting, that's all fresh water. So what ends up happening is that ice is melting. It's changing the salinity of the oceans around the caps on each side. But when it comes to wintertime, is that because the salinity, and you all know what happens when you have salt water freezes at a different temperature. When you thin out and you reduce the salinity in the water, it freezes more. So they're getting more melting, but they're also getting more freezing at the time. So this is all stuff that isn't put into these accounts of what they're talking about, these polar ice caps melting. You're getting a lot of melting, but you're also getting more freezing. And this is not put into the debate. And this is the whole thing, is that this is why I always get sort of, like I said, raise my eyebrow to this global warming thing, is that there's so many other factors and processes that are happening with the sun, with us going around the sun, with the precession of the earth changing. The earth goes through cycles, and all these cycles, we don't understand them. We barely even have explored most of what our earth is. They've had earthquakes that have happened. Okay, so we have our land, and earthquakes happen, and disappearing rivers and lakes just gone. Where did the water go? It went underground. So this is another factor that can end up happening with rising oceans. There could be other catastrophes, earthquakes or volcanoes, or the water could be go somewhere else underneath ground. So we haven't explored that area. You look at what was done, is that I think the deepest drilling that was ever done was the one that was done over in Russia. And I think they went down to 6, 7 miles or whatever. That's the deepest drill hole. And I think the Marianas Trench is the deepest point of the earth. I think that's around 7 miles, 12 kilometers or something like that. And you figure what the radius of the earth is like, we're looking around 4,800 miles. So we've only gone down, the deepest part is around 6 to 7 miles. And the mantle is hundreds of miles thick. There's lots of parts underneath there, cave systems, holes, pockets there. Water can always go down as of gravity. You have gravity always goes down. Water is just going to find its lowest point. Now, is it going to say that all water is going to stay on top of the earth and flood all these cities? That's all just a prediction. Don't know. Couldn't happen. But as they're saying, water's going up over the past few years in South America and other places over in Eurasia, is water levels have just disappeared. Beaches and areas, and you can see these videos um, on on uh, on the internet or even off of YouTube, where the water has just disappeared. Venice was another place there. They've never ever had this before. Is that their canals? I think this was a couple years ago. The water had just receded and just disappeared, and people were wondering, says, "Oh, was this a part the pre-dawn of a tsunami that was coming?" But there was no tsunami. But just water levels, just weird impacts that we don't still understand that are going on. So if you're having all this water that's supposed to be melting, and levels are rising, but we're also getting areas where water is receding at never before seen observable rates, where you can just go out and half a mile off of the coastline is just straight down to the beach sand or down to the bottom. And how do you account for that if we're increasing the water, but the water is getting less in other areas? See, that's all understanding about what's going on. And I'm not going to implore you to do whatever, but I always say is that you have to go and look at all the different factors and who is telling you what it is and what they want done, especially when it comes to these green people. I don't want to make it sound negative, because I think a lot of stuff that they do say makes sort of sense, and I think im environmentally impacting is a way to go, and to resource and to for resources and to sustain the life we have, that we do not impact the earth in a more negative way. But we also can't stop uh, technology and our progression of our life on earth. So when you put all these factors all together, and you look at what's going on and what's being said, I think the message is good, is don't pollute, try to maintain, and let's find new ways and new technologies use what we have. Like there's been a lot of new technologies where they've been able to take recycled plastics or plastics from the landfill and make new products. They've done that with tires. They found with reusing old tires, because I don't believe you can reuse the rubber in the same way, but they can be ground up and used into roadway asphalt, which actually make asphalt roads last longer. And the parts with plastics, mix them with other materials there to make longer standing telephone poles instead of using wood poles, which will last a lot longer and a lot more stronger and are lightning resistant. I guess electricity resistant in a way of dampening, so you don't have to worry about being shocked. There's so much more stuff that we can do with the information that we have today, that we can make things better for life tomorrow. So all I'd ask you for is that, if you're listening to this, and I hope you are, is that when people are giving you climate statistics and facts to present a point, you have to go back and look about who is telling you these statistics and points and what is their process for it. Instead, everybody wants to have a nice place to live, a place where it's not a dump, and everybody is sort of responsible for that. And people that are polluting in a way that makes it worse for the rest of us, well, yes, they should be held accountable for that too as well. But also, with new technology, you can't stop the process of learning and the earth. And all we can do is look forward to maintaining and keeping it green as best we can, and try to not impact the earth as a negative impactor. That's the best that I could say for the part with that. So the whole conspiracy thing comes down to, out of this, is that look at who's telling you and what is the process that they're telling you. Some people are looking at it for is to make money, to stop buying this product to buy something else, and it's a product that they support or they've been paid to support or paid to endorse. And changing our processes is going to be a long period of time. You're not going to see a whole area where we're going to see all cars and transportation get away from the petro impact, because we still haven't even come up with a proper technology for electric vehicles. The battery technology isn't even where it should be. And then there's also a process problem with the batteries themselves, is that what do you do with that battery once it's used up? The materials in that battery are just environmentally bad as the coal and gas. And see, we're not at that point yet. And the transition just to stop one to start something else will never happen. And I've seen that in with government, is that you have to, it's always a slow process. You can't just stop one thing and start a new thing, because it never works that way. It's all a part with regulation and slow change. And I think that's going to be the best way that we'll see this problem fix itself in the future. So just always remember, look at it more of an environmental impact of what the impactor does, instead of this buzzword of global climate warming, global cooling. And look at, there's so many other factors of business and what people are affecting our atmosphere and our earth in other ways that might be not be just the same way that what these green climate environmentalist people are saying. So just something to think about on that part of the global climate warming and conspiracy. So I hope you all had a great night, and hope I shedded some light and just my point of view on sort of things. And thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you guys next week.